can I ask a question?
Yes.
If Christianity were true, is it plausible that suffering is necessary for God's purpose?
Hey guys, welcome back to Save Skeptic. I'm Josh, and today we are going to look at a new video that dropped from the channel Jubilee, where atheist Alex O'Connor takes on a room full of Christians and debates the existence of God, specifically that, according to Alex, all the suffering in the world makes God's existence unlikely. Now, I do think both sides do a great job, and I give props to Alex for being able to take on a room full of his opposition and deliver his points so clearly and effectively. Let's dive in.
I'm an atheist and host of the Within Reason podcast, and today I'm surrounded by 25 Christians who, God willing, might be able to change my mind. My first claim is that suffering makes God's existence unlikely. Good work.
Hey Alex, how's it going?
How's it going? Nice to meet you.
Sage. Why don't you just begin? Why does suffering or evil make God's existence unlikely?
I think one can...
Really quickly, good start for this young man here. By asking what he means, what Alex means, he's able to get clarification and penetrate to the heart of Alex's issue. But let's
with two hypotheses, so atheism, naturalism, or theism. We should ask what we expect would occur under either hypothesis. And then we look at the world and we see what does actually occur. And what do we find? We find, I think most relevant here, a system of natural selection, the mechanism by which God apparently chose to bring animals and ultimately human beings into existence. A system which...
Okay, right off the bat here, Alex starts with a huge assumption by saying that the very mechanism God chose to bring about the human species is predicated on suffering. He's basically assuming evolution and that man is the result of evolution, a theory that even many scientists today are backing away from. I would contend that evolution is a lie from the pit of hell to deceive the world into believing God is not needed. But let's continue.
Which is defined by suffering. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and suffering and destruction of the unfit. I'm told that the very mechanism that God chose to bring about the human species as the ultimate end of his creation was one that is imbued with suffering, such that 99.9% of all the species, let alone animals, that have ever existed on planet Earth have been brutally wiped from existence.
Yes, maybe species have been wiped out, but the world is still teeming with life, which is all sustained and preserved by and through God. If we read the scriptures as intended by the original authors, we find a God who has been working to reduce suffering since he first created the world and when it was good. It was mankind who brought about the suffering upon the world, and now God is working to fix what we messed up. Let's continue.
Extinction. And I think that that's less likely on theism. If you assume atheism or materialism, not only do you explain this, you also come to expect it.
What is your, I guess, epistemology? How do you know that this is the case, that it's less likely and that, an atheist worldview, a naturalistic worldview would look like the way it is today?
Of course we don't know, but that's why I use the phraseology of unlikely. I think that if you were to tell somebody who was sort of in some, Rawlsian state of nature, hadn't seen the world, and you said that the world has been created by an omnibenevolent, all-powerful God, what kind of world would that person be imagining? And if you dropped them into the world, if you were given the opportunity to become a wild animal, like in 2 seconds, I was just going to turn you into a random wild animal somewhere on planet Earth.
I like being a guy.
I think you'd probably kill yourself before I had the opportunity because you know that the life of these animals is almost defined in terms of their suffering.
Okay, really quickly before we get to his response, the problem I see with Alex is that he props up his argument in a vacuum. He focuses so much on the suffering that he forgets about all the beauty and goodness in the world. Yes, there are certain situations where suffering may impact a singular creature or one person more than another, and it's hard to see why a good God would allow that from our limited perspective. But to use his analogy of being plopped down on earth as an animal, he automatically assumes that animals are constantly suffering. But that's not what we see, and at least for anyone who spends any amount of time of nature like I do. I live up in the mountains, I'm outside all the time. It's much more peaceful and serene than you go into the city and you see a lot more suffering. So we find lots of beauty and peace and serenity where animals are living quite nicely. So I don't buy his premise that all animals are in constant suffering. So I seriously doubt his assumption that animals are living and suffering across the world. I mean, whether you want to believe it's evolution or God, I believe animals were built for their environment and do not suffer like we think they do. In addition, suffering is maximized through thought, whether through memory or worrying about the future, and it seems clear to me that animals do not ponder like humans do. So this alone would minimize an animal's suffering greatly and equip them for a life in the wild, something I believe God mercifully gave to the animals in his foresight of knowing that mankind would sin against him and his creation, leading to a world with suffering. Let's continue.
I guess I just don't really see how you can justify that claim per se. What I would say is that if we actually take into account the holistic view of the scriptures, which I do think that you have to do, we see that it's actually much more coherent once you acknowledge that evil itself doesn't have ontology. Evil's not a thing. You don't look under a rock and say, there's the evil, right?
Fine by
And
me. So I'm not really talking about evil here, because that's, of course, a moral term. I'm talking about suffering.
can you distinctualize suffering and evil?
So evil is a moral term. Evil means that something is bad, it's immoral. You need to have a moral ontology for that. Suffering is just any experience that's not wanted when experienced, right? And so even if you don't have a moral objectivism, you can still say that suffering exists. So here's a question. A deer gets its leg caught under the branch of a tree that's fallen over in the wild, and it starves to death in confused agony. Why does God oversee this? And why does God set the natural world up such that events like this occur?
Well, because the ultimate view here is that
Okay, pause.
But Alex is basically saying that it's morally wrong for God to allow so much suffering. So they're very intertwined, morality and suffering, at least from Alex's point of view on this argument. I wish they would have let him finish, because he was likely going to show the viewers why suffering exists in the first place, according to the Bible. And it goes back to what I said earlier about mankind bringing suffering into the world with sin. And we also have to remember that Jesus Christ took on the sin and suffering of the world to redeem it. That sounds like a loving God to me, a loving parent that would willingly take the punishment for their child's wrongdoing while still upholding justice.
Good work, Alex and man.
How's it going?
My
Nice
name's
to meet you
Tim.
too.
Okay, so my first question to start out with is, what exactly about suffering makes this unlikely on the condition that God exists?
I think that if God is all loving, then he probably wouldn't want his creatures to suffer. And so I think that the fact that they do suffer makes his existence less likely.
Okay, perfect. And is there some specific aspect of suffering that you're particularly honing in on,
Yeah.
horrendous or
In
whatever that is?
particular, non-human animal suffering. Because I think that the Christianity has a celebrated tradition of theodicies trying to explain why suffering exists.
Yeah.
Human free will, the development of the soul, higher order goods, all of this kind of stuff. None of which apply to the suffering of non-human animals.
Have you heard of the axiological expectation mismatch problem?
I have not.
This is a
Okay,
good point.
so
One
philosophers
that I
of
hadn't
religion
heard of.
have started to understand that the thing that actually generates a problem between God and suffering is actually the value system you attach to the very attribute of perfect lovingness. Because the problem of evil is an internal critique, you have to look at a very specific version of theism and how it defines perfect lovingness. I want to present to you a version where my version of perfect lovingness does not actually constitute a problem and a misalignment, that mismatch between the suffering of animals, let's just say the profusion of suffering of animals,
Great.
and the existence of God.
So let's hear it. What kind of God are we imagining that would allow and oversee and do nothing to prevent billions of years of untold animal suffering?
Right, so you're talking about non-prevention.
Or setting up the system that is natural selection, such that that it relies upon things like predation, and disease.
Well, the first part is I don't agree with the whole setting up the system part. So I'm not one of those theists that believes that God does this select and pick idea of creating worlds. I don't think that God actually creates worlds. I think that God lets worlds develop according in a certain way, but because God can oversee an overarching narrative, he knows exactly how he can redeem anything. The first, sorry, go ahead.
Could God have made it
I'm not sure exactly what he's trying to say there, but it does sound a little bit like deism to me, but I could be wrong. But I get his point, and I think it's a good one. How do you define a loving God's actions? Perhaps your idea of what a loving God would do is not actually in alignment with God or his loving intentions. I think that's what he's trying to get at here. So let's continue.
such that animals were all herbivores instead of carnivores and omnivores?
Yes, he could totally do that.
Okay,
but-
so had he done that, here's an instant way to
He did do that back in the garden. Come on, Alex. I thought you knew the scriptures, and I thought this was an internal critique of scripture. But anyway, let's continue.
reduce the amount of suffering that exists.
Right, but hold on. That's particularly assuming a value theory already that I haven't told you I'm adopting that has a problem with the evil. So I have to give you my value theory first for you to show that misalignment.
Okay, let's hear it.
Perfect. Okay, so my value theory says that it's not the most important thing about a sentient creature is not what merely happens to them. It's about the total timeline of their life and how and where their life permanently ends. Meaning, if you were to judge an author of a narrative and the first few chapters, let's say, there's a lot of bad things happening, but the end ends with this crescendo where there's victoriousness, there's redemption, there's beauty, and everyone in the story actually endorses their entire existence that they lived. They can look at their they can look at their total timeline, and they actually each subjectively come to the conclusion, I'm glad I was made, and I totally see what my suffering was for. That's the particular I'm using with. So we have to judge, like John Hicks says, we have to judge the very nature of God's lovingness by what he does in the end, not these few time slices that we observe right now. For you to show that there's a problem, you have to show to me that the suffering of animals cannot be transformed, are intrinsically cut off from being transformed into a life that they will endorse. There's a couple of theses on the table.
Okay.
But sure, go ahead.
Okay, so are you talking about the end of their life is in their end of life on Earth, or are you talking about the afterlife?
I'm antemortem, postmortem.
Okay, because if you're just talking about life on Earth, then I would say that if you had an author writing a book and a character, if we were trying to figure out the relationship between that author and the person in the book, and that person in the book shows up for 5 seconds in the first chapter and is a child who almost immediately dies of cancer in an incredibly painful way, and there's no development, there's no sort of bringing back to life and suddenly everyone's grateful for it. It is just this miserable, tragic experience. And I asked, well, what did the author not want to do for the story of the book, but want to do for that character?
Yes.
I think it would be pretty damning. And also, when it comes to animals, we're talking about animals who are predated on from the moment that they begin existence.
Absolutely.
They sort of have disease. Zebras, when they're killed by lions, are often too big to be killed instantly, so they die over minutes with their windpipes caught in the jaws of a lion. How can this be developing a zebra, which, by the way, probably doesn't even have the same kind of first-person conscious experience that humans do in order to sort of rationalize and abstract and learn from their sort of past and morally develop in that way? They just suffer. And
I think Alex accidentally undermines his argument here and shows that this suffering of animals isn't as bad as it would be for humans, because animals don't have the conscious experience to learn from their experience. This is the same reason they don't have the ability to experience pain and suffering like we do.
And what kind of God could oversee this?
Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions on the table again. Again, you're assuming a particular value system that I'm not laying
I'll tell you what
out.
I'm assuming here. What I'm assuming here is that a good God would not allow unnecessary suffering to obtain.
Okay, gotcha. So we can talk.
Who decides unnecessary? Sounds like to me, Alex, in a way, is playing God. But anyway,
Agree with that?
We can talk about unnecessary suffering. We're talking about the justifying norms for suffering. You're saying it has to be in terms of necessity, which is an evil is only authorizable by God if it's in connection to a greater good or prevention of a greater evil, correct?
If there's some kind of justification for allowing that suffering.
Yeah, but you're saying it's a necessary connection. Why you say, what's the term necessity?
So perhaps I should say unjustified instead of unnecessary.
Okay, so we both agree. I do not believe that God can authorize justified, unjustified suffering.
Tell me how that example that I gave you, the deer with its leg starving, is justified.
Because it's intrinsically redeemable, and the norms I'm working with is not this necessity condition that you're working with. Mine is about redeemable suffering, with redeemability, or we call it defeasibility. If that suffering can be defeated within the creature's life, and I'll define what I mean by defeat, which is that they can retroactively look back at what they went through and integrate it into their life history, where they look at their life.
I have to interrupt because the example I gave you is one where the deer dies.
Yes, the deer dies. But here's the thing. You're probably talking about this post-mortem example. Sure. I'm going to put one thesis on the table. There's two philosophers that defend exactly what this goes through. One defends that animals will be given a martyrdom status, while God will be able to present himself in a way to animals in the afterlife, such that in the same way you could give praise to a dog, and the dog emotionally recognizes that he's loved and that his life is worth living, right? To these animals that suffered like that, there's one view on the table, which is that God will give them a praiseworthy status where they will be able to actually see that.
Can we talk about that claim? Because these animals are suffering for what? I mean, God might cause them to suffer a bunch.
Means to ends. This is not means to ends.
God might cause them to suffer a bunch and then essentially redeem them in the afterlife. But what?
Okay, so whether you believe the theology or whatever behind this young man's defeater, if you will, he's basically just showing there are other options, right? So he's doing a great job of showing that Alex's barometer for defining suffering as unjust is only one of many ways to define it as such. Alex has built in a lot of presuppositions into his argument. So for Alex, if suffering doesn't include a certain criteria, then it must be unnecessary, and therefore it's unlikely that a loving God exists. But perhaps God has a greater purpose in mind for those animals or for the world at large, like this young man just said. And indeed, God does. In fact, God will redeem all of the world in the end as he works all things to his good purpose. But Alex is prescribing a certain set of reasons suffering should be allowed based on his own limited experience. it looks to me that Alex is playing God, like I said earlier. And because God doesn't act the way he wants, he can't believe in him. I get Alex's moral quandary with animal and human suffering, but has he stopped to think about why he has such a big problem with it? Where does that desire come from, if not from a God who also cares and wants justice for all living beings on the earth? The very tool he uses to discount God, his morality, he uses to fight against God's existence. Does he not see the irony in this? I don't know. But let's continue.
Like, why do this? If I were to punch you in the face and then give you $20,000 afterwards, you might be grateful for the $20,000,
Yeah.
but why couldn't I just give you the $20,000?
Well, see, so that's assuming. So I saw your debate with Trent. Nice to meet you.
How's it?
Oh, okay. So I would say that's a good point from Alex, but I don't know if a world where everyone is given this hypothetical $20,000 reward is the best possible reward. I would think we must endure this world's pain and sorrow and suffering to truly acknowledge the good that's to come.
Hayden, nice to meet you.
Would you say that theism or atheism better account for the idea that suffering exists and a purpose for it?
Depends exactly what you mean, because of course you might say that the world itself is more expected on theism, and since suffering, needs the existence of the world, that it's theism. But granted the existence of a material world, let's say, I think atheism.
Okay, why does suffering exist at all? Like in an atheistic worldview, what is the cause of suffering?
Oh, well, because however life began, it developed through a series of natural selection, which requires animals to develop senses that they wish to avoid in order to be more likely to survive. And that's why pain receptors evolve. In a world where not all of these pains are actually going to kill us, we're left with situations in which we're in a lot of pain but don't end up dying for it.
Would you agree that consciousness is necessary for suffering?
I would say probably, yeah.
Does atheism account for consciousness?
Yes, that's what I was talking about a moment ago. Perhaps not. Maybe theism accounts better for consciousness than atheism does.
So if there is no consciousness, there is no suffering. Is that right?
That's probably true, yeah.
So if atheism cannot account for consciousness, then it cannot account for suffering. Would you agree with that?
So I think what we're doing here is we're sort of slightly shifting the goalposts. If you don't want to grant the existence of the material world before we start talking about this, we can do an argument from consciousness, but then we need to debate whether consciousness is explicable on atheism. What I'm going to say is this.
Sure.
What I'm going to say is this. Consciousness may seem to imply the existence of a conscious creator of the universe. We're here talking about, I suppose we're talking about Christianity, and the claim was about God, but the God that you believe in, that.
Yes, we're talking about Christianity and God. This is an internal critique. And it's interesting that he earlier threw out the whole theology behind man sinning and allowing suffering to come into the world. He threw that out. But you can't just take or leave what you want if we're arguing within the framework of the Christian worldview, the Christian God, the God of Christianity, the God of the Bible.
Say, if we grant that there is a creator deity who sort of brings about the universe of conscious creatures, have you ever heard of the evil God hypothesis that Stephen Law popularized or came up with?
Tell me it.
So the idea is that, like, imagine that there's a God who brings about the world and creates the world, but does it maliciously because he wants human beings to suffer. He brings about a world in order so that human beings will suffer. Right? That seems like a plausible hypothesis. And even if you think that consciousness points towards God, the kind of God that a lot of Christians think is a sort of necessary quality of God, which is to be all-loving, might not have to apply here.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
If Christianity were true, is it plausible that suffering is necessary for God's purpose?
If Christianity is true, then I think it must be necessary, because there'd be no other explanation.
Okay, so we're not talking about whether or not Christianity is true.
But if you're asking me if it's plausible that Christianity is true and therefore suffering is necessary, I would say probably not, because I don't think suffering should be necessary or could be necessary.
In an atheistic worldview, I would agree with you. It makes no sense at all. But okay, I would ask this question.
So can I ask you
Sure.
why then, if God exists and wants to come to know everybody and wants to love everybody and does so for the sake of human beings, why he chose to imbue the world with so much suffering that is at least seemingly completely inexplicable?
Are you a father?
No.
I'm a father.
This is a good point.
I want my son to become just like I am, better than I am, I should say. I want him to become the best that he can be. Is it possible for him to reach his potential without suffering in his life?
Perhaps not, but there's
suffering is necessary.
There are a few things I want to say.
Okay, before he responds, I just want to say this modern society looks at suffering much differently than the ancients. In fact, I would go so far as to say that we look at it upside down from those before us, as the ancients saw suffering as necessary for development and to avoid a selfish, lavish, meaningless existence. And yes, Alex is talking about unnecessary suffering, but he throws that term out there like it's some sort of gotcha. Who decides what's unnecessary? Him? But let's see how he responds.
Firstly, that kind of moral development doesn't apply to non-human animals, as I've already said, right? That does not account for that does not account for the brutal death of animals in the wild. Also, if I don't want to talk about your son because it's tragic to think about, but somebody else's son has suffered and died immediately as a result of that suffering, they don't get to develop in the same way.
I would agree that on a micro level, it's very hard to justify. And we can ask the question, why doesn't God intervene on all of these sufferings?
You might be able to justify an amount of suffering. Yeah. Right, but the fact that there's so much gratuitous suffering in the world is what I think makes God's existence unlikely. There are some instances where maybe a certain amount of suffering brings about a certain amount of good in a situation. That, by the way, would count as a justification. But when a child dies of leukemia and they're dead,
could there be a purpose to it? What if the death of the child brings their parents to God?
Then perhaps then the parents should be grateful that their child got leukemia because it's doing the will of the Lord.
Not necessarily.
This is actually a great response, and I don't think Alex wants to entertain it because it doesn't help his argument, hence him throwing out that comment in jest. But if Alex honestly wants an answer to the problem of suffering from a biblical perspective, then he should explore this possibility further. I mean, the Bible says that God's ways are higher than ours, and that who can know the mind of God? So anyway, let's move on.
That seems
all right, pause.
No.
Hello.
Hey, nice to meet you. How are you?
Good. Repeat your claim one more time.
That suffering is unexpected if a good God exists.
Unexpected. Mm-hmm. So when you say unexpected, like you're caught off guard by it, or you're expecting like all good things to happen over
that
time?
If I assume that there is a good God supervising, invigilating the universe, that I would not expect to see so much suffering.
Right.
So much gratuitous, seemingly unnecessary suffering.
Right. And you know, the most beautiful thing is that our God is not unfamiliar with suffering as he suffered himself. So would you say that there is like some beauty in suffering in some way?
I would say that there can be sort of poetically, you can look at suffering and think that's a beautiful story, but I don't think that the person suffering, especially if they die as a direct result, might think that. Also, I think that if I knew someone whose child died of leukemia and suffered for it, and I went to them and said, but hey, there's some beauty in the suffering, isn't there? I think I'd be kicked out of the funeral.
Right. Well, I would say like the same thing for a woman giving birth, right? It's suffering, like it sucks, it hurts.
Sure. But imagine you could have the giving birth without the pain of giving birth.
Right.
Would you prefer that?
Of course, yeah, you would prefer that.
So then if God can bring about the good stuff without the bad stuff, then there's no reason to bring about the bad stuff. So what we have to show is...
I mean, of course God could bring about the good without the bad, but with the case with the woman giving birth, does this suffering not bond her more with the child? I don't know because I've never given birth, but isn't it funny that all of the great things in life come after a lot of suffering has been endured to get there, from childbirth and raising good children, to developing sound moral character, to even God redeeming the world through the cross. Let's continue.
Why the bad stuff is necessary to bring about the good stuff. Otherwise, it's not justified.
Right. Well, could you say that the result of why we suffer is because of fall of man?
I would say not, because I don't believe in the fall of man.
Right, true.
Alex here again contradicts himself because he just said a few minutes ago that this is an internal critique of the God of Christianity. In case you forgot, check this out.
We're here talking about, I suppose we're talking about Christianity, and the claim was about God, but the God that you believe in.
So which is it, Alex? You can't have your cake and eat it too.
But I also don't think that explains non-human animal suffering. The big thing that I want to keep pressing is that the theodicies that we talk about, free will, fall of man, all of this kind of stuff, I don't think applies to that deer with its leg caught under the branch that's dying in confused agony. What's this for?
So what?
It does apply to the deer because, like she said, the fall of man brought about the suffering of the world.
Is it about animals that seems so like more important than a human?
It's not that they're
suffering?
more important. It's that, as you say, like it seems plausible at least that a human can suffer and then be sort of better off for it, or that they can enjoy poetry of suffering, the poetry of suffering. Animals can't do that.
They also can't reflect on suffering like we do, and they also can't anticipate suffering like we do. Which I would argue, the anticipation and the thinking of in the past of it is far greater than in the actual moment.
Right.
Animals can't enjoy the poetry of suffering.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't know. I never like talked to an animal and said like, "Hey." Like...
I have. They just haven't talked back.
See, this is a very good point. Subtle but true. This gets to the heart of Alex's argument. How can he possibly know how much suffering the animal kingdom endures? He has no direct knowledge of a single animal suffering, but he harps on it to try and drive his point.
the problem. But I just don't see why we would expect that God would oversee this system of
Right.
natural selection.
Right, but
Billions of animals suffering and dying, predation, disease, eating each other alive, leaving each
Right.
other to bleed out on the
Right.
floor. And this is being supervised by an all-loving God?
Well, do you think that's God's intention from the very beginning of creation of all things?
I think that God oversees the mechanism. God could have made it, for example,
Right.
one example that I've already given is that God could have made animals herbivores, which just eliminates the problem of predation.
I mean, there are some
He did make all the animals herbivores in the beginning. Again, if Alex is going to argue internally with the entire corpus of scripture, then he needs to recognize what the scriptures actually teach on this. But he doesn't want to acknowledge, I guess, some parts of it that undermine his argument.
animals.
There are, but he could have made more of them. He could have made all animals herbivores, thereby eliminating the suffering and predation.
So is the issue
Predation
of them eating each other?
That's one issue. That's one way that God could have sort of, I think, quite trivially reduced the amount of suffering. David Attenborough once said of his documentaries, people who complain that we put too much violence in the documentaries should see what we leave in the cutting room floor. The animal world is just filled with unimaginable suffering. Just predation is
But there's also cute
unimaginable.
things about, like, otters holding hands so they don't.
Exactly. There are many cute things. Okay. Like I said before, I live in the mountains and it is absolutely beautiful and serene. We see deer every day, literally just enjoying themselves in the woods. So what he's painting here is not a clear picture of reality, I don't think.
Swim away.
All right,
Could you have that
guys,
without
pause,
suffering?
pause,
That's the
pause.
question.
Well, this was all very interesting stuff, and I'm glad they brought on, for the most part, Christians that knew their theology. They continue with more in this. If you want to watch the full episode, you can. The link's below. But let me know your thoughts. Is Alex right? I mean, does the suffering in the world make it unlikely that a good God exists? I don't know. You guys tell me. In the meantime, take care and God bless.